Hi, and welcome to the lecture on terrain in Unity. So I've split this into two parts. In this part, we're just going to create the terrain, and then we're going to put a nice grid on it. And in the second part, we're going to start molding the environment so we can then build our scene on top of it. So let's get started. So this is where we left off. All of our objects, all imported into Unity. Our terrain, our plane here. So let's just select the plane that we created, the map plane. There's two ways of selecting objects. You can either select it in the scene if it's visible, or you can select it from the list of objects over here on the left, like that. And I want you to just turn that off by ticking this little box up here, off. There you go, so we can't see it. Okay, so now we want to create our terrain. Go up to Game Object, 3D Object, come down to Terrain here, and click Terrain. It's not in the right place yet, but don't worry about that. And you can see the corner of our terrain is at 0. We will want to move that in a moment. Okay, so what we want to do is, in the inspector over here, with your terrain selected, click on this little star here, like so. You get all the information related to the terrain. So the first thing we're going to do is lower it. And the reason why we're going to lower it is because currently we cannot do any dips. We cannot create any dips in the terrain because it's at 0, and the level of the terrain is at 0, if you know what I mean. So we can set the level of the terrain higher but still have it on 0, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Okay, so if you go up here, up the top, position, you want to set this about minus, let's say 100. You can see the size of it. Terrain height is 600. These are world units, so we've got 600 world units to play with, so it can go up 600 units from where it is. So if we say minus 100, let's do minus 150 just to be on the safe side. So it's down minus 150. So if you go to here, in here, the second button along, paint height. So this allows us to paint the height, and in this value here where it says height, you can see it's set to 29 currently. What you want to do is set it to 150, like that, same as your value you put in white, and go flatten, and it raises it back up to 0. But now it's actually not raised it to 0, it's raised it up 150 units from where it was. By doing that, it levels it off and gives us space to carve rivers, valleys, whatever. So that'll do for that. Now we're going to place it in the center. If we go back in here, we can see our terrain is 500 by 500. We don't really want that. We want it to be 460, because this is our map size, by 370. So that's the same, that's our map size. And if we turn our map plane back on, you'll see it doesn't at the moment, but it will do when we put this in the center. So let's go and put that in the center. So half of 460 is 230, so minus 230 in the X, like so. And in the Z we want minus 185. Minus 185. Like so. That should make it central to 0. So 0's there, and you can see that looks pretty central. If we turn on our map plane now, back on, you can see it pretty much matches, and you can't see it because the terrain's in the way, but we can move that out. And you can see it's exactly right, which is very, very cool. And I know what you're saying, why don't you just put that onto the terrain? Well, there's a reason for that, so we're going to do that now. Now we're going to put a grid on here. And what I've done, if you go into your raw projects files, double click and create a folder called terrain, like so. We're going to store imagery for the terrain in here. And I've already started doing that, so open up to the terrain folder and you'll see I've got this JPEG file, and I'm going to let you have this. So it should be attached to this lecture, so go and download it if you haven't got it already. And what this is going to be our grid. We're going to put this grid as a base layer on our terrain. And the reason why I've put 512 in these boxes is because in a moment Unity is going to ask me how I want to tile my image across the terrain. Go into your assets root here, right click, create folder and call it terrain. So we've got a terrain folder in here, and we've got a terrain folder in our raw project files. And if you remember, this is going to appear in our other folder, in our mirrored folder for the actual Unity files, which we don't touch. We only touch that within Unity. So open that up, so you can see it's empty. Go to your terrain folder in here and copy this into there like that. Let's shut that folder down. Okay, so now we have this. Go to terrain, click terrain here. Edit textures, add texture. So make sure you've gone to, let me just do that again. So go to your paintbrush here. Go to edit textures here and click it, and then click add texture. And you'll get this box. Now I want you to grab this and drag it into the albedo smoothness box there, not texture 2D, and then just let it go. Okay, so down here it says size, and what this is at this point you've got to determine how big your textures are going to be on the terrain. So if your texture is 512 by 512, for example, and you want your 512 texture to sort of stretch across no more than 1 unit, that's 1 meter on your models, then you would put 1 in here, because these are world units, and it's asking you there how many times do you want your image to stretch across world units, basically. So I've already decided that our texture for our terrain is going to be 2048, and I do want 1 unit to cover 512 pixels in both directions. So basically I want my texture, my 2048 texture, to cover 4 units. So in here you put 4, and then in Y you put 4, and you add. And you should see now, and we know that this box, let me just get that box cube. Okay, let's move it. Is 1 unit, and it should pretty much fit inside there because I did my calculations. Yep, exactly. So it's what we call texel size, and I'll explain this in more detail later on. So what I've established here is that when we create our textures, we're not going to paste a texture any more or less than 512 by 512 across 1 unit of geometry. Because if you start mixing and matching, you get blurry textures. So if I take my 512 texture and I stretch it across 2 units, it will look blurry compared to our floor or any other texture in our scene. So we want our textures to be consistent throughout. So 512 pixels per 1 unit. That's what we're going for. Our texture that we pasted on here was 2048. Therefore it covered 4 units, and that's why in there for this one I put 4 by 4 because I want that texture, which is 2048, to cover 4 units in both directions. Now if I brought in a texture that was 1024, that would be 2 and 2 because it only covers 2 world units. If I brought in a texture that was 1024 on the X but only 512 on the Y, it would be 2 and 1. So you can see what that does. It's letting you determine how many world units your textures cover, basically. And you can see it's bang on exact. Perfect. So that's that established, and that, as they say, is our terrain. It looks pretty hard on the eyes, but we're going to be painting on this in a minute and it's all going to look pretty cool. And we can actually go in and change that now we've established it. We don't have to keep that grid, those horrific colors like that. Yeah, we don't have to keep it the same, so we can modify that so it's not so hard on the eyes. Bring our matte plane back, just floating above, and be using that to shape our terrain shortly. So that's part 1. I hope that was really useful. It's particularly important to get the textures right. If you're using the same as mine, then do exactly what I've done here. If you're using your own and you want smaller textures, i.e. 1024, or it's best to keep them to the power of 8. So 512, 1024, 2048 or 4K textures. It's entirely up to you, but make sure you tile them and you determine how much texture you want on 1 unit. That's it. I hope that was clear. It can be a little bit confusing, and I'll go into more detail with this when we start actual proper texturing, and give you some examples to make it even more clear. But it was just important to get that right now while we're doing the terrain, because we've got to get all these things organized before going forwards, or we end up coming backwards and fixing loads of stuff. So that's done that. So okay, that's it for now. Now in the next lecture we're going to start shaping it, so I'll see you there.